Number 1. Dennis Rader. For 30 years, this church leader and Boy Scout master lived a terrifying double life until a single floppy disk finally exposed his secrets to the Wichita Police Department in 2005. Digital forensics on a deleted file from that disk traced the metadata back to a computer at a church in Park City, Kansas. The results pointed to a man who had never been on the radar of investigators. How did he hide in plain sight? Dennis Lynn Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, in March 1945, the oldest of 4 brothers, raised in a typical working-class household. He served in the United States Air Force and attended Wichita State University. He eventually finished a degree in justice administration, appearing to everyone like a perfect citizen. He spent years working for ADT Security Services, actually installing home alarm systems for the people of Wichita. Later, he served as a compliance officer for Park City, where neighbors knew him as a rigid, detail-obsessed man. He was the neighbor who handed out citations for long grass or loose dogs with unsettling joy. He was married for 34 years, raised 2 kids, and led his church congregation as president. He even led a Boy Scout troop. He was, in the eyes of his neighbors, remarkably unremarkable in the most ordinary sense. But there was a darkness nobody saw, not even his wife or co-workers. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader was responsible for killing 10 people across the Wichita area. His first strike was the most brutal of all. The horror officially began in January 1974, when 4 members of the Otto family were slaughtered inside their Wichita home. Joseph Otto, his wife Julie, and 2 children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, were found by the older siblings coming home from school. Police found evidence of ligature restraints and noted how controlled and methodical the killer had been throughout the crime. No suspects emerged. Over the next several years, the body count just kept climbing. Catherine Bright in 1974, Shirley Vienne and Nancy Fox in 77, Maureen Hedge in 85, Vicky V, Jurley in 86, and Dolores Davis in 91. Every scene showed a repeating pattern of behavior and a cold, calculated approach to both the murders and the evidence left behind. In October 1974, a letter to a Wichita TV station claimed the Otto murders and introduced a terrifying new name, BTK, bind, torture, kill. More communications followed through the years. He sent messages to the media and the police, including secret details that only the killer and investigators could possibly know. These letters proved he needed to be noticed and that he was watching the investigation very closely. Then, after killing Dolores Davis in 1991, the monster went silent for 13 years. Was he gone forever? The case went cold until 2004, when a new letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. BTK was back. Over the next few months, he sent multiple packages to both the police and the local news. These contained crime scene photos and personal items stolen from his victims. Investigators confirmed these new messages perfectly matched the original BTK writing style from decades earlier. Every submission underwent careful forensic analysis. A secret task force was revived, and federal agents joined the hunt to catch him before he struck again. Then came the purple cereal box. In February 2005, a purple cereal box arrived at a TV station containing a single floppy disk. The disk held a deleted Word document. Digital forensic experts successfully recovered the metadata, which showed the file was created on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church and last modified by a user named Dennis. Detectives identified Dennis Rader. They put him under constant surveillance and secretly grabbed a DNA sample from his daughter's medical records. They compared it to biological evidence from the old crime scenes and found a perfect familial match. The trap was set. On February 25, 2005, police pulled Rader over near his home and took him into custody. In June 2005, Rader appeared in court and entered a guilty plea on 10 counts of first-degree murder. He gave a chillingly detailed plea. He explained how he scouted his victims, how he planned the attacks, and the exact sequence of every murder. He spoke with a clinical tone, showing no visible emotion. Prosecutors had built a massive case using the disk metadata, the DNA, and items found in Rader's own house. They had 30 years of letters and evidence stacked against him. The defense didn't even try to fight. There was no trial. Rader's cold confessions in open court became the final word on his legacy of terror. Because Kansas had not yet reinstated the death penalty when most of these murders were committed, the sentencing options for the court were strictly limited by law. 10 life terms ensured Dennis Rader would never see freedom again. In August 2005, Judge Waller sentenced him without parole. He remains at El Dorado Correctional Facility today, an 80-year-old prisoner waiting for the end of his life. Investigators in Oklahoma and Missouri are still re-examining cold files for any homicides potentially connected to Rader's spree. Those probes continue today, haunting his daughter Carrie, who remained totally blind to her father's secret life. Throughout her life, she spoke publicly about the case multiple times, recently for a 2025 documentary series exploring the massive investigation and legacy. That single floppy disk, which broke the 31-year silence, finally sits in an evidence locker. But another storm was brewing. Number 2. Reginald and Jonathan Carr. A survivor's account documented by Wichita Police Department investigators in the early hours of December 15, 2000 described a brutal multi-hour ordeal spanning several locations across the city as the brothers hunted. She gave her statement from a hospital bed after being found walking barefoot in sub-zero winds near a residential street on the city's southwest side. That testimony triggered the single largest criminal investigation in the history of Kansas. But who were these men? They were brothers, born in Wichita just 2 years apart, Reginald and Jonathan Carr. Reginald in 1979, Jonathan in 1981. They grew up fast and mean. Their childhood was a cycle of instability documented across several jurisdictions from a very early age. Neither finished high school. Both were career criminals before they even reached adulthood. By age 20, they had convictions stacked up in both Kansas and Colorado. They did time for theft, robbery, and assault on several different occasions. By late November 2000, both were back in Wichita. Associates who knew them described the brothers as volatile, transactional predators who operated without a single thought for any legal or moral consequence. No steady jobs, no stable place to live. Detectives later used witness accounts and cell records to rebuild their movements. They were about to step into the light. That light exposed an 8-day spree of chaos starting on December 8, 2000. On that date, they hijacked Coach Andrew Schreiber at gunpoint in a parking lot, forcing him to hit multiple ATMs before finally letting him go. 3 days later, on December 11th, they found Ann Wenta. They shot the 55-year-old cellist in her driveway on the city's east side after she had a chance encounter with them. She survived long enough to provide a description to investigators before succumbing to her injuries. Then, the violence escalated. That horrific escalation occurred in the early hours of December 15th, 2000. 5 people in their 20s were relaxing at a Birchwood Drive residence when the 2 armed men smashed through the door and forced entry. The intruders held the group captive at gunpoint for hours inside that house. They forced the victims to empty their accounts at ATMs. The brothers then subjected the group to horrific violence and sexual assault. In the early morning hours, they loaded all 5 victims into their own cars and drove them to a soccer field at Murdoch Park. Evidence and trial testimony established that the brothers shot all 5 at point-blank range, leaving 4 dead on the cold soccer field. One woman, known as HG, miraculously survived the execution. Analysis confirmed a hair barrette deflected the bullet, saving HG's life. She lost consciousness, but woke up alone in the dark. Naked and bleeding, she walked over a mile through the freezing night until reaching a home and summoning emergency services. She was their only hope. Her statement to police, given within hours of the massacre, became the bedrock of the state's case. CSI teams moved quickly, processing physical evidence from Birchwood Drive, the ATM sites, and the soccer field at Murdoch Park. Lab techs rushed to analyze DNA samples found at multiple locations inside the residence. They reviewed vehicle logs and bank surveillance footage. Within 48 hours, both Reginald and Jonathan Carr were in custody as the forensic picture began to take shape for detectives. DNA evidence directly connected both brothers to the Birchwood residence and the victims. Security cameras caught the men forcing the victims to withdraw cash. HG sat on the stand and identified them. Ballistics matched the guns to shell casings found at the soccer field. Together, this evidence gave police a consistent and perfect timeline of those 8 days. A survivor walked miles through snow to convict these brothers of capital murder. Their Sedgwick County trial became the longest death penalty case in the history of the region. Prosecutors showcased forensic data, ATM footage, and the crucial testimony of HG. Her testimony rebuilt the horrors of Burwood Drive and Murdoch Park for every sitting juror. Defense teams fought the evidence and questioned the legality of the brothers' original statements. Jurors weighed both sides as the case dragged on. But would the verdict hold? The verdict held. Reginald fell on 50 counts while Jonathan was convicted of 43. Both received death. Decades of appeals followed, eventually reaching the United States Supreme Court. In 2016, the nation's highest court reinstated their previously overturned death sentences. The Kansas Supreme Court later reaffirmed both death warrants in 2022. By 2025, both men remain on death row amid ongoing legal challenges. To this day, the survivor HG remains anonymous despite her central role in the trial. She remembers every mile she walked through December snow in 2000 to find safety. Her story remains a legendary survival testimony. But she wasn't the only one hunting monsters. Next up, John Edward Robinson. A 2000 welfare check in Lynn County sparked a massive 15-year missing persons investigation. A simple missing persons search soon spiraled into a nightmare scenario for local detectives. Police stood over a rural farm, prying open industrial barrels. The contents changed everything. Inside were bodies. Robinson's life began in 1943 in a working-class Catholic home. He was an ambitious child and Eagle Scout who seemed perfectly normal to everyone. A choir boy, he knew exactly how to manipulate his image in polite, structured circles. That mask defined his adulthood as he cycled through various jobs in the following decades. He played the roles of medical administrator, lab director, and high-level business consultant. His titles were fakes. Missouri and Kansas records show a long history of fraud and theft. Robinson faced multiple theft convictions as his true criminal nature began to surface. He repeatedly violated his probation, yet always managed to reinvent himself in a new city. By his move to Kansas City, he successfully posed as a wealthy, respected entrepreneur. A married father of 4, he appeared to be a pillar of his suburban community. Friends saw a generous, outgoing man who always seemed to have the right answers. He was a man of solutions, not problems, but his perfect mask was slipping. The truth surfaced in 1984 with the first disappearance linked to Robinson's name. Paula Godfrey vanished after taking a job with Robinson, leaving her family in total shock. Her parents received a letter claiming she left voluntarily and wanted no further contact. Investigators believed the letter then, even as more women began to disappear without a trace. Lisa Stasi vanished in 1985, followed by Catherine Clampett in 1987. By 1994, Beverly Bonner and the Faith family also disappeared after meeting Robinson. In every case, forged letters and power of attorney forms appeared to explain their absences. Benefit checks kept arriving for the missing women for years. How was that possible? He faked it. Robinson forged every document to create a false life for his victims. By the mid-90s, he stalked online BDSM forums using the digital handle Slavemaster. He lured women with fake job offers, financial help, and the promise of relocation. In 1999, Isabel Luowa moved to Kansas City after months of chatting with him. She disappeared almost immediately after her arrival, sparking a frantic search by her family. Suzette Troughton followed the same path in early 2000, unaware of the lurking danger. When Suzette vanished, her mother called the police, finally bringing Robinson's dark world into light. 2 massive chemical barrels sat on a Kansas farm, hiding the remains of women missing for 15 years. In June 2000, investigators swarmed Robinson's rural Lynn County farm, executing warrants for a grim discovery. They also hit his Raymore, Missouri storage unit. Back at the farm, they pried open 2 85-gallon drums. Both held human remains, while 3 more barrels were recovered from that Missouri storage locker. These 5 barrels contained bodies belonging to women who vanished over the previous 15-year period. Experts identified the fallen: Suzette Troughton, Isabel Luica, Beverly Bonner, and Ann Sheila, along with Debbie Faith. Robinson was arrested June 2, 2000, launching a massive multi-jurisdictional manhunt. Digital forensic experts scoured every file on Robinson's computer records. They recovered messages documenting his contact with victims and the dark timeline of their final surviving days. Analysts scrutinized letters sent to grieving families over the years, looking for the killer's true hand. Handwriting analysis soon connected several of those cruel notes directly to Robinson. Financials showed him cashing benefit checks of the missing women, funneling their money into accounts he controlled. The evidence cataloged 15 years of documented predatory behavior, stretching across 2 different state lines. Robinson first faced capital murder charges in Kansas for 3 of those horrific homicide cases. Prosecutors described the case as the longest and most complex in Kansas history, placing forensic evidence and digital records before the jury. Financial documentation supported harrowing testimony from women who survived Robinson's traps and could speak to his specific predatory methods and patterns. Defense lawyers fought to bury the digital evidence, attacking the chain of custody to protect their client's life. The jury found him guilty on all capital counts, sentencing John Edward Robinson to face the death penalty. He later pleaded guilty in Missouri for 5 life terms, just to avoid another capital murder trial. John Edward Robinson currently sits on death row inside the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Now, 81 years old, he continues to fight his death sentence through the Kansas appellate process. Law enforcement texts cite this as the first documented example of a predator using the internet to hunt, a pattern established a full decade before the public realized the web was a hunting ground. Number 4. Dana Chandler. A Topeka police report from July 7, 2002, documented a gruesome discovery inside a residence. 2 people were found dead on Southwest Eveningside Drive, sparking a decades-long homicide investigation. The entire case was defined by an absolute lack of physical evidence that would haunt investigators for the next 20 years. Detectives had a bloody scene and a narrow list of suspects that quickly centered on one specific individual, but they lacked the evidence needed to make an arrest for 9 long years. Dana Chandler was born in the mid-50s and lived most of her life around the Topeka, Kansas area. She was once married to Michael Sisko. They had a daughter before the marriage ended in divorce. By 2002, Sisko was moving on, engaged to marry a woman named Karen Harkness. But Chandler hadn't moved on, according to evidence later used against her during her murder trial. Witnesses described Chandler's escalating behavior toward her ex-husband and his new fiancé as a disturbing, sustained pattern. Her stalking included unwanted contact and constant surveillance that disrupted the couple's daily lives and peace. Neighbors noted that Chandler's fixation on the pair only grew more intense as the wedding date approached. To those watching, her emotional stake in her ex-husband's life went far beyond what was warranted. She worked various jobs in Topeka, but her personal life was becoming the central legal focus. Ultimately, her private history and her actions in the years before the July 2002 murders would force her to stand before 3 separate jury proceedings. The horror of July 7, 2002, began with plans for a simple family fish fry. Sisko and Harkness had invited family to their Topeka home for a scheduled Sunday afternoon gathering. When family arrived to a silent house, they let themselves in only to find the couple dead in the bedroom. Both victims were shot, yet there were no signs of a break-in and nothing of value was taken. The bedroom was a forensic dead end, offering no fingerprints and no clear trail back to a suspect. No DNA surfaced to point the way, and no witnesses reported seeing anyone near the house that day. Police viewed the lack of forced entry as a key detail, but what did it mean? The most chilling evidence in this double murder didn't come from a lab, but from the killer's own daughter. Before that revelation, police were haunted by the fact that whoever entered the home left absolutely no physical evidence of how they got inside. Investigators quickly shifted their focus to Dana Chandler, noting her long history of documented conflict with both of the victims. The lack of forced entry, combined with no obvious signs of robbery, kept Chandler at the center of the investigation for years. Detectives spent months retracing her steps and analyzing her movements around the time the 2 victims were shot. They scoured records to pin down her location on the night of July 6th and the morning of July 7th, while witnesses recalled her strange behavior. The real breakthrough didn't come from the crime scene, but from the data transmitted by local cell towers. Records showed a phone linked to Chandler was in the immediate geographic area of the Topeka home during the murders. Witnesses later testified that Chandler made specific statements after the killings that only someone with intimate knowledge of the crime would know. This wasn't a case solved by a single fingerprint, but by a decade of circumstantial threads woven tightly together. In 2011, 9 years after the bodies were found, police finally arrested Dana Chandler at her new home in Oklahoma. She was extradited back to Kansas and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But the legal battle was only beginning. The first trial in Shawnee County ended in a total stalemate when the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. Prosecutors didn't blink and immediately began preparing to take the case to trial for a second time. They secured a conviction, but the verdict was thrown out after the lead prosecutor was disbarred for professional misconduct during the case. With that conviction overturned, the state prepared to do it all over again in a third murder trial. In early 2025, a new jury faced the same mountain of evidence built over the last 14 years, starting with the cell pings. They listened to the same witness accounts regarding Chandler's erratic behavior and the suspicious statements she made after the fact. The prosecution leaned heavily on the lack of forced entry and the toxic, documented history of conflict Chandler had with the victims. They argued that the combination of motive and opportunity led to only one possible conclusion. Defense attorneys countered that after 3 trials, the state still couldn't produce a single piece of direct physical evidence. They insisted that a circumstantial case wasn't enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a double homicide. This time, the jury reached a decision and returned guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent during the sentencing as Chandler's own flesh and blood prepared to speak. Her daughter looked the court in the eye and named her mother as the killer. Then Chandler took her turn to speak. She completely ignored her daughter, directing her remarks toward the judge and a lawyer who had already passed away years earlier. She refused to acknowledge the jury's verdict or the gravity of the proceedings that had finally caught up to her. The judge sentenced Dana Chandler to 2 consecutive life terms with no parole for 50 years, though her appeals continue today. This case survived 3 trials, 2 decades, and a disbarred prosecutor to become one of the most complex in Kansas history. But while one long road to justice finally ended, another was just starting on a quiet Thanksgiving night. Number 5. Craig Kaler. Late on November 26, 2009, a frantic call reached the Osage County Sheriff regarding multiple gunshots in rural Burlingame. When deputies arrived at the remote property, they found 4 people dead inside and around the family home. In the middle of the carnage, they discovered one survivor, a young boy who was miraculously still alive. The investigation would eventually climb through the state courts and the Kansas Supreme Court before reaching the highest bench in the nation. How does a man who swore to uphold the law end up at the center of such a brutal massacre? By all outward appearances, Craig Kaler was a man who lived a life of total discipline and structure. A Kansas native, he built a career in public service and eventually became the police chief of a small local community. He was a father of 4 and was married to Karen Kaler, appearing to be the pillar of his family. To anyone watching from the outside, the Kalers looked like a normal household grounded in routine and responsibility. Fellow officers knew Kaler as a competent and disciplined leader, qualities that defined his long career in law enforcement. But that image of professional control was about to shatter under the weight of a personal life in freefall. By November 2009, the carefully constructed walls of Kaler's life had started to crumble. His marriage to Karen hadn't just hit a rough patch. It had completely and publicly disintegrated. She had officially filed for divorce, moved out of their home, and taken all 4 children with her. At the same time, Kaler lost his job as a police officer, stripping away the professional identity he held for years. Trial witnesses later described a man who responded to these losses with a sense of growing and dangerous instability. He slaughtered the women but spared his son in a house of total horror. His toxic obsession with Karen only festered, rotting into a dark fixation that never truly faded. By Thanksgiving 2009, Karen Kaler was seeking refuge in the town of Burlingame. She stayed with Dorothy White, an 89-year-old grandmother who provided a rare sanctuary for the family during their painful separation. Also present were their 2 teenage girls, Lauren and Emily, along with the youngest Kaler child. The son was there too. Detectives pieced together the night's events through cold physical evidence and forensic mapping. They relied on forensic science and the haunting testimony of the only child left breathing. On November 26th, Craig Kaler drove to the home and shot and killed 4 people inside and around the property. Karen, Lauren, Emily, and Dorothy White all died right there at the family residence. But he spared the youngest son, who deputies later found and took into protective custody. The evidence proved this wasn't a random outburst, but a cold, targeted, and deliberate execution that left no room for doubt. Within hours, investigators identified Killer as their primary suspect. Police took him into custody the very next day without any further incident. The case was a slam dunk, with zero questions regarding the identity of the killer. Physical evidence proved he was there, a fact that Killer himself never even contested. The trial would focus on the law's response, not the question of who committed the crimes. Everything hinged on whether his mental state carried any weight regarding his criminal responsibility under strict Kansas law. Kansas utilizes a highly unique legal framework for the insanity defense. It prevents defendants from arguing they didn't understand that their actions were fundamentally wrong, a standard that most other states allow today. Killer's defense team fought back, claiming this specific legal framework was completely unconstitutional. They argued the law denied their client a meaningful chance to present a defense. They claimed it violated his 14th Amendment rights to due process and his right to a completely fair trial. Prosecutors pointed to the clear premeditation, noting that Killer drove to the home with intent. He carried out the executions in a sequence that showed a focused mind, not one broken by disease. The jury weighed the expert testimony against the rigid requirements of the Kansas legal system. In 2011, they found him guilty and sentenced him to death for capital murder. But the fight moved to the appeals court, challenging the very foundation of the state's law. By 2019, the United States Supreme Court took up the case of Killer versus Kansas. In 2020, the High Court upheld the state's restrictive insanity defense framework. The majority ruled that the Constitution doesn't force states to define insanity in any specific way. They affirmed that states have the power to write their own rules for mental health defenses. The ruling had a massive impact, reaching far beyond the specifics of the Killer case. It confirmed that states can restrict mental health defenses even if they differ from national norms. Following that ruling, the Kansas Supreme Court affirmed his death sentence in 2022. Killer remains on death row today, housed at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. His case remains a permanent benchmark in the national debate over the constitutional boundaries of the insanity defense and how states restrict it. Number 6. Kyle Flack. A 2013 missing person report led investigators to a rural farm near Ottawa, Kansas. A routine check quickly turned into a massive search for bodies buried on the property. Franklin County became the epicenter of the most significant capital murder trial in years. The people reported missing from that farm would never be found alive by the search teams. Kyle Flack grew up in rural Kansas, spending his life within the borders of Franklin County. He was in his mid-20s and lacked the typical red flags that alert police to killers or draw institutional attention before a crime. Flack wasn't a public figure. He was just another quiet face in a small social circle. Neighbors described a man living on the margins of a tight-knit town with a cold temperament and strictly transactional relationships. Records later documented a man whose temper could snap without any warning or cause. He was already on the police radar for some minor issues, but his history gave no hint of the carnage they would find on his property. He had been in a relationship with a woman named Kay Bailey, and that connection along with her circle would become the focus of the entire case. He had no career to speak of, and no local ties that made him stand out. To those who knew him, he was defined by his personal drama, rather than any real goals or a stable life of his own. The search for the missing people started with Andrew Stout and Kay Bailey, who were last heard from by their loved ones in late April 2013. Bailey's family called the police when she went silent for several days, a total disappearance that they claimed was completely out of character. Stout had also vanished. Law enforcement officers reached out to Kyle Flack during their first round of questioning. His answers regarding where the two might be were noted as being totally inconsistent. The case took a turn when a third person, Stephen White, also went missing. White had seen both Bailey and Flack just before the vanishings. Police secured a warrant for Flack's farm. What would they find? What the search team found on that land was the recovery of remains in several spots. Forensic testing eventually confirmed that the victims were Andrew Stout, Stephen White, and Kay Bailey. The recovery took several days to process the entire scene. The evidence showed the bodies were hidden on purpose and had been there for a long time before discovery. Every piece of proof from the sites was logged and sent for expert lab analysis. But a fourth victim then pushed the investigation into even darker territory. Kay Bailey had an 18-month-old daughter named Lana, who was last seen with her mother. When the toddler could not be found through family, medical records, or any social service contacts, investigators searched more of the land. They eventually found the remains of little Lana Bailey. Forensics confirmed the 18-month-old had been shot. She was only a baby. The evidence collected against Flack was both massive and systematic. Ballistic testing linked the firearms found near Flack to the deaths of several people. DNA and physical evidence from the property were matched against the remains they recovered. Witnesses who spoke with Flack around the time they vanished gave more context to everything. Their testimony helped build a timeline of how Flack acted before and after the crimes. Cell phone data was pulled and studied. This case relied on layers of forensic proof. Every piece of physical evidence was woven into a clear story of what happened there. Flack faced 4 counts of capital murder in a Franklin County court. The trial was finally ready to begin. The state showed the jury the forensic results and the guns from the farm. They highlighted the witnesses and the many lies Flack told during the initial police investigation. Much of the state's case focused on the fate of Lana Bailey, the youngest victim, and the cold, calculated way the killer carried out these acts on the farm. The defense tried to fight the evidence and asked if the forensics really proved the exact way each victim died, or if there was still room for reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated and came back with guilty verdicts on all 4 murder counts. Kyle Flack was sentenced to death in 2016, making him the newest person on death row in the state of Kansas. The Kansas Supreme Court performed a mandatory check of the entire case and the death sentence as required by state law. That review upheld the convictions and the sentence in full. Flack is still held at El Dorado today. His case has gone through the standard appeals allowed for death row cases in Kansas, but so far, no court has changed his original death sentence. The rural Franklin County farm where the bodies were found has not been in the public news since the final appeals process was finally finished. The killer targeted a specific community with lethal intent, but he committed a mistake that would haunt his legacy forever. Number 7. Frazier Glenn Cross. On April 13, 2014, at 1:00 p.m., 911 dispatchers started receiving frantic calls. Callers reported an active shooter hitting 2 locations within a half-mile radius in the quiet Johnson County suburb of Overland Park, Kansas. Officers arrived in minutes to find 3 people dead, but the gunman hadn't even tried to run from the crime scene. They found him sitting in his car at a nearby school and took him in without any resistance or fight. Finding the killer was the most straightforward investigation in the entire history of Kansas law enforcement records. But the secrets behind the man in the handcuffs were anything but simple. Frazier Glenn Cross, also known as Frazier Glenn Miller, was 73 years old when they caught him that afternoon. He spent most of his adult life as a notorious white supremacist figurehead after being born in North Carolina in 1940. Cross had served 20 years in the Army, surviving 2 combat tours in Vietnam before his final military retirement. For most veterans, that military career would define their entire life and their public identity forever. For Cross, his uniform was completely overshadowed by the hate that came next. After retiring, Cross became a major figure for neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups across the South and the American Midwest. He founded the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and later built the White Patriot Party. This paramilitary group drew federal heat for stockpiling weapons and recruiting active-duty soldiers from the United States military. He was convicted on federal charges in 1987, served his prison time, and was eventually released into society. For decades, Cross continued to organize and publish his hate through various white supremacist platforms and later through early internet forums. He even attempted to go mainstream by running for office in Kansas on several different occasions. He never got the votes, but he maintained a constant face within those extremist networks. By 2014, he lived in Missouri near the state line, and his hate had not softened with age. His personal writings from the days leading up to April 13 showed a man becoming dangerously obsessed with his targets. His work showed a growing and intense fixation on Jewish people and their institutions. What was he planning? The locations targeted were the Jewish Community Center of Greater Kansas City on Antioch Road and Village Shalom, a Jewish retirement community nearby. Cross drove into the Jewish Community Center parking lot and started shooting at everyone he could see in the area. He killed 2 people at that first scene. One was William Lewis Corporon. William was a 69-year-old doctor there with his grandson, Reed Griffin Underwood, for a local singing competition. Cross then drove to Village Shalom, where he opened fire and killed Terry Lamano. Terry was a therapist visiting her mother. All three victims died right there at the crime scenes. Here is the detail that shocked everyone. None of the three people Cross killed were actually Jewish. Police caught Cross in a school parking lot just minutes after the final shots were fired that day. As officers shoved him into the back of a patrol car, news cameras were already rolling on the scene. With the world watching, he made statements loud enough for bystanders and news crews to hear them perfectly clearly. He leaned out and screamed Heil Hitler at the reporters, and the crowd gathered at the scene. That footage was broadcast nationally within hours, making it perfectly clear who the killer was and why he did it. Cross was caught red-handed. Investigators spent the following weeks documenting his hateful ideology and the meticulous planning that led to the April 13 attacks. Prosecutors wanted to build a case strong enough to secure the death penalty for his crimes. They found digital records at his home showing he was talking to extremist networks before the shooting happened. His writings established a clear ideological plan that prosecutors would use to explain his deliberate choice of targets. Physical evidence, ballistics, and surveillance tapes were all assembled into one comprehensive record for the trial. The state built a case so solid that there were no evidentiary gaps left for a defense team to use. He was charged in Johnson County with 3 counts of capital murder and several other serious felonies. Cross decided to represent himself, creating a media circus that drew massive national attention to the legal proceedings. During the trial, Cross used every chance to deliver hateful speeches to the jury instead of fighting the evidence against him. The defense didn't contest the evidence because the killer wanted credit for every drop of blood he spilled. Prosecutors called eyewitnesses who had been at both crime scenes, presenting security footage, digital breadcrumbs, and the first-hand accounts of the law enforcement officers who finally forced Cross into handcuffs. After a short deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on every single count of capital murder. At his sentencing, Cross gave a speech that grabbed the entire nation's attention for one final, dark performance, using his platform to shout the same twisted ideology instead of offering a single word of remorse for the proceedings. In 2015, the jury demanded the death penalty and the court handed down 3 death sentences. This local Kansas case was joined by federal hate crime convictions that ensured he would never see the sun again. Frazier Glenn Cross waits on death row today. His history is preserved in federal records on domestic terror and academic research, examining the exact moment where radical ideas turn into a plan for mass murder and targeted violence. He murdered 3 people, a grandfather, his young grandson, and a woman visiting her mother at the time. They were complete strangers, linked only because they were present at the facilities Cross had targeted for death. Number 8. Scott Schwer. A phone rang at the Greenwood County Sheriff's Office on the morning of January 19, 2005, reporting that a routine warrant service at a rural farmhouse outside Hilton, Kansas, had turned deadly. Sheriff Matthew Samuels, the elected leader of Greenwood County, had been shot at the rural property. He was rushed to a medical facility but was pronounced dead shortly after he arrived there. The killing triggered one of the largest police responses the region had ever seen in its history. A multi-agency standoff lasted for hours as personnel from across the state established a hard perimeter. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court, but it all started with a 20-something man named Scott Schwer. By 2005, Schwer was a man defined by a brutal meth addiction and the dangerous underworld surrounding it. He grew up in the rural landscape of Greenwood County, a quiet part of Kansas. It is a sparsely populated stretch of the Flint Hills, where communities are small and quiet. Houses sit miles apart, and law enforcement resources are usually stretched very thin across the region. Schwer did not have an extensive criminal history before that cold morning in 2005. However, people who knew him described a man spiraling into drugs and acting with increasing volatility. He was losing touch with the people and the routines that kept him grounded as his dependency grew worse. He had no stable job history at all, no home and no ties to anything. His world revolved around a network of people who made and sold meth in the rural parts of the county. Anyone who saw him in the months before the shooting knew he was operating on the absolute edge. He was unpredictable and completely out of control. Lawyers later argued in court that his brain was fundamentally changed by years of sustained substance use. The warrant that brought Sheriff Samuels to the farm was for meth. They knew Chver was likely there. Samuels and his team walked toward the residence to serve those papers as the sun came up. Investigators proved Chver was inside and was high on meth as the officers stepped onto the porch. When police made contact, Chver pulled a gun and fired, hitting Sheriff Samuels with several fatal shots. The sheriff died from those wounds almost immediately after being pulled away from the scene of the crime. Chver retreated deeper into the house as a massive standoff began and the regional police arrived. State troopers and local deputies from the neighboring counties established a line around the rural residence. Negotiators talked to him for hours, while the rest of the state watched the perimeter grow tighter. Eventually, Chver surrendered and was taken into custody. But would the defense find a way to explain the shooting? Actually, establishing the basic facts of the murder was the easiest part of the entire investigation. Scott Chver was the shooter. Multiple officers saw him pull the trigger, and the physical evidence matched every single word of their reports. Ballistics proved the gun used and recreated the exact sequence of the morning's violence at the farmhouse. Blood tests taken after his arrest proved just how high he really was when he fired the gun. A unanimous Supreme Court eventually ruled that Chver's own insanity defense was exactly what allowed the state to legally send him to death. Investigators initially built a massive, direct mountain of evidence proving he killed Sheriff Samuels, but the real legal battle was just beginning. Did his meth-fueled brain mean he lacked the intent for murder? The defense was betting his life on his drug-induced mental state. Attorneys brought in mental health experts to argue that Chver's extreme methamphetamine use created a neurological state where premeditated action was physically impossible. This high-stakes medical strategy dictated every move the lawyers made as they prepared for a showdown in the courtroom. Prosecutors refused to back down, officially hitting him with capital murder charges. During the trial in Chver County, the state paraded witnesses and officers who watched the horror unfold firsthand. They laid out the ballistics, the forensics, and the medical proof of his intoxication for the jury to see. The prosecution detailed the exact moment Sheriff Samuels died and the violent standoff that followed. Was it an open and shut case? Not quite. The defense countered with experts who claimed methamphetamine had completely hijacked Chver's cognitive functions and his ability to think. They argued that because of his chemical condition, he couldn't have formed the deliberate intent required for a capital murder conviction. The state needed an answer. Prosecutors fought to bring in their own mental health professional to dismantle the defense's claims. This rebuttal witness was ready to look at the same brain and see something entirely different, something much more calculating. This move sparked a legal firestorm. The defense claimed that using this expert would violate Chver's Fifth Amendment rights. They argued the prosecution's expert used Chver's own private statements to condemn him, which looked a lot like forced self-incrimination. The jury didn't buy the defense's story. They returned a guilty verdict for capital murder. Chver was sentenced to die, but the battle over his Fifth Amendment rights was far from over. His lawyers fought through the appeals until 2013, when the United States Supreme Court took the case of Chver versus Kansas. In a stunning, unanimous decision, the justices ruled that if a defendant uses a mental health defense, they open the door. The prosecution is constitutionally allowed to bring in their own rebuttal expert to challenge those claims. Crucially, that expert can use the defendant's own statements to prove their point. This ruling ended years of legal confusion in lower courts and finally drew a hard line in the sand. It clarified exactly how far Fifth Amendment protections go when a killer claims they weren't in their right mind. The blow to Chver was total. All 9 justices agreed he had no right to block the state's medical evidence. His death sentence stood firm after the Supreme Court's ruling and survived every legal challenge that followed. Today, Scott Chver sits on death row in Kansas, waiting for his time to run out. The loss of Sheriff Matthew Samuels, an elected officer killed serving a routine warrant, remains a scar on the rural community. Kansas records cite his death as one of the most significant law enforcement fatalities in history, leading us to number 9, Justin Thurber. In January 2007, a desperate report hit the Coffeyville, Kansas Police Department about a missing 19-year-old woman named Jody Sanderholm. She was a student at Coffeyville Community College, last seen leaving a local spot in the dark, early morning hours. Her family was frantic when she never made it home or called. How does a young woman just vanish? Within days, The missing persons search turned into a grim homicide investigation as the trail led straight to someone Sanderholm knew. The evidence pointed toward a man who moved in the very same social circles she did. Justin Thurber was only in his early 20s back then. Investigators locked onto him quickly, but his background didn't immediately scream killer to the small southeastern Kansas community. He grew up right there in Coffeyville, went to the local schools, and seemed like any other neighbor. He lived the kind of quiet, low-profile life you see in tight-knit towns where everyone's social circles eventually overlap. Sanderholm knew him, and so did her friends. They shared the same small-town geography where everyone knows everyone else. They walked the same streets and frequented the same establishments that define the boundaries of daily life in a college town. Before that fateful January, there was nothing in his official records to suggest he was a danger to anyone. He had no major criminal past and no documented red flags that would have put him on the police's radar. People who knew him said he was unremarkable, a man who blended into the background without ever standing out. He existed in the community without drawing any particular attention to himself, for better or for worse. Nobody would have ever guessed his name would surface in a murder investigation before that terrible winter month. The last time anyone saw Jody Sanderholm alive was at a Coffeyville business in the early morning of January 7th, 2007. A decade later, he lives. Witnesses at the bar saw her leave that night, marking the moment she vanished. From that second on, she vanished. No one saw her, and every single phone record went completely dead. When she didn't come home and her phone stayed silent, her terrified family called the police immediately. Cops hit the streets, hunting for grainy security footage along every possible route she took home, while tracking down every single person who was inside that bar with her earlier. Early on, the mission was simple: find her very last known location. Which way did she go? And exactly who was she talking to in those final moments before she disappeared forever? The search ended. They found Jody Sanderholm's body in a field outside town just days after she disappeared. Investigators swarmed that rural dirt, treating the area as a crime scene. Lab results provided a major evidentiary breakthrough, uncovering a direct biological link that tied Justin Thurber straight to Jody Sanderholm's recorded murder and death. They sent biological samples from the scene and Thurber's own gear for high-priority forensic DNA testing. The science was undeniable. The DNA results placed Thurber in direct contact with Jody at that very exact moment. But the DNA wasn't the only clue. Police found physical evidence inside Thurber's car and home that backed up every single forensic discovery they made, creating a perfect, terrifying timeline of events after Jody walked out of that bar for the last time. With the lab reports in hand, the investigation moved lightning fast. They named Thurber as their prime suspect and hauled him in. Detectives squeezed him for statements, then tore his words apart using the hard science they already had in hand. Prosecutors built a mountain of evidence using DNA profiles, physical items from the scene, and forensic analysis. They tied his car, witness accounts of Jody's final hours, and the physical proof he was at the body's location together to make a case that was absolutely and fully complete. No other suspect existed here. Not one shred of evidence pointed to anyone else, making the final conclusion by the detectives completely unavoidable. How could he deny it? Montgomery County, Kansas, officially charged Justin Thurber with both kidnapping and capital murder. During the 2009 trial, the jury saw every single piece of forensic proof that the investigation assembled. Prosecutors presented DNA analysis, incriminating items found in Thurber's vehicle, and accounts from people who saw Jody at that same Coffeyville bar. They locked in the timeline of her last hours and the gruesome findings from where her body was dumped. The state's legal argument was built entirely around core forensic evidence, with witnesses and physical clues providing the dark framework for justice. Defense lawyers tried poking holes in the evidence and questioned how things were collected, but was it enough to save him from that needle? They couldn't offer a single believable story that made the jury doubt Thurber's absolute guilt. The jury found him guilty. In 2009, Thurber was sentenced to die, but 15 years later, the executioner is still waiting because of a massive legal battle over a claim that could change the entire American justice system forever. His lawyers argue Thurber has an intellectual disability that stops everything. Under the Eighth Amendment in Atkins versus Virginia, if they prove his low intelligence, the law forbids his execution. Is an intense intelligence test really enough to halt a death sentence today? This single argument has dragged through Kansas courts for over 10 years, sparked by clashing opinions from different experts. Debates over testing standards and legal proof have slowed this case to a crawl, keeping Jody's final justice on hold for many years. Jody's father, Brian Sanderholm, and her sister, Jennifer Aldridge, have fought this agonizing legal delay every single step of the way. In early 2025, they stood before Kansas legislators to speak out during a very heated debate over the state's current death penalty rules. They told the room what it's like for families to be trapped in an appellate process that lasts for many long, painful decades. They called these endless hearings a second trauma that only makes the pain of the original crime even harder to bear. Their words hit every major Kansas news outlet and shifted the entire state's conversation on whether the death penalty actually works today. Today, Justin Thurber is still breathing on death row. His death warrant is frozen while the courts argue over his mind, leaving the victim stuck in legal limbo with no confirmed end in sight. Number 10. Gary Clayass. Before anyone knew Carrie Williams was gone, a killer had already moved in next door. In October 1996, the Crawford County Sheriff's Office recorded the disappearance of the 20-year-old, a student at Pittsburgh State University in Kansas. Williams vanished from the area near her off-campus home, and after several days of silence that terrified her family, they filed a formal report. Little did they know, they were about to uncover a nightmare that would change Kansas law forever. The evidence investigators found in the following days ended the search for a missing person and launched a capital murder case. This sparked a legal battle spanning 30 years, ultimately rewriting the constitutional rules for the death penalty in Kansas. But who was the man at the center of it? Gary Clayass was 37 years old at the time. When police looked into his past, they found a detail that set him apart from almost any other suspect who lacks a violent history. Clayass was already a convicted murderer. Years earlier, he killed someone in Missouri, served his time, and walked out on parole. That parole sent him straight to Pittsburgh, Kansas, where he lived just before October 1996. The fact that Missouri's legal system released a killer who then struck again became a massive legal and public flashpoint. He had no job in Pittsburgh and zero ties to the community, and he completely ignored the parole supervision meant to keep the public safe. Neighbors who saw him before Williams vanished described a man who was a ghost, drifting through the town without leaving a trace or a reason for notice. Was he already hunting? Carrie Williams was a typical student, living just off the Pittsburgh State University campus. Friends and family remember her as someone deeply involved in college life, attending classes and maintaining the social life that defines the undergraduate experience. Her disappearance was totally out of character, forcing investigators to treat the case with immediate urgency. The hunt intensified the moment her silence was formally documented. Detectives found physical evidence belonging to Williams near her home and in the surrounding area. That trail of evidence led them straight to Gary Clayass. Within a very short time, police had Clayass in handcuffs. Soon after, the investigation led teams to Williams' remains, a discovery that confirmed the homicide and gave forensic teams their primary crime scene. Every detail at that scene was meticulously recorded and sent for analysis. The DNA found there linked Clay directly to Williams and the site where her body lay. The case against him came together fast. They had DNA, physical clues, the proximity of Clay paws to the victim, and zero other explanations for the crime. Because of his prior murder in Missouri, the prosecution knew they were dealing with a man whose capacity for lethal violence was a proven legal fact. Crawford County prosecutors filed capital murder charges, citing the brutality of the crime, which involved sexual assault, and used Clayass's past killing to seek the death penalty. During the 1997 trial, the jury saw a mountain of evidence that proved his guilt beyond a doubt. DNA was the core of the state's entire case. Biological markers at the scene were a match for Clayass that the defense couldn't challenge. Witnesses mapped out Williams' final movements and showed how Clayass was right there in the shadows. The jury returned a guilty verdict and recommended that he be put to death. Gary Clayass was the first person sentenced to die under the new Kansas statute, a law brought back in 1994 after years without an execution framework. By being the first person sentenced under this new law, the Clayass case became the vehicle for a massive constitutional challenge. In 2004, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that the state's sentencing method was unconstitutional, This single ruling threw the entire Kansas death penalty into total chaos. Imagine waiting for an execution that becomes legally impossible. Kansas's death penalty structure just collapsed. Was he finally safe? Not even close. The state appealed, and in 2006, the Supreme Court finally reversed the lower ruling in the case of Kansas versus Marsh. This companion case raised the exact same constitutional question. The conclusion? The sentencing framework in Kansas was legal. This restored the death penalty's power. Pass's legal grounds for execution were back. But could he still find a new way? He tried. Years followed that 2006 court ruling. Standard reviews began. Every time, the courts reaffirmed Pass's death sentence. Post-conviction challenges failed to change a thing. The original sentence stayed. Any hope left? No. Now, mid-60s, he remains on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He's spent nearly 30 years under a sentence that was once erased, then resurrected by the highest court in this entire and truly great country. The Gary Clayass case holds a haunting, singular spot in Kansas's history. He received the first death sentence under the state's reinstated law. His journey tested the law's foundations at every judicial level. In the end, the highest courts confirmed the entire system was legally sound and valid forever. It began with a missing person report in October 1996, Crawford County. That legacy now reaches far beyond the crime itself, leaving a mark on the American legal system off.